To all those out there who live in areas near wide stretches of empty land like I do, I'm sure you've already been warned why it's dangerous to travel on back roads at night. Growing up in Seattle, one of the biggest cities on the West Coast, I never really needed to worry about the dangers of driving in the middle of nowhere until I committed to a college in eastern Washington. For those of you who have never been there, the eastern side of Washington is very different from the western side. Some may even think that they accidentally took a wrong turn into a different state. Primarily used as farmland, eastern Washington is almost completely absent from all the elements that give the other side its famous reputation. Instead, this side is mostly just rolling fields of wheat and dried grass that stretch into the distance with a few tumbleweeds and windmills here and there. Driving through this area while the sun is still out is actually quite pleasant on a nice day. The big sky above and nothing but miles and miles of golden hills on each side of you. Driving through eastern Washington at night was one of the most nerve-wracking experiences I ever had, and here's why. If you've ever had to drive down a dark country road at night, I'm sure that you've already been lectured by everybody and their mothers on the obvious dangers like drunk drivers, falling asleep at the wheel, and animals suddenly running across the road. In my particular area, we have a lot of issues with head-on collisions, mainly in part of antsy students passing cars recklessly in an effort to get home faster. In addition to these more sensible hazards to be aware of, there's also a lot of superstitions like ghosts and murdering hitchhikers that wait on the side of the road at odd hours of the night, begging for a ride. To top it all off, probably the most dangerous part of driving on these back roads at night is the fact that there is no cell service throughout a massive part of the area. So basically, if anything happens to you out here, you're screwed, because you'll have no way of contacting anyone for help. There is no civilization around for who knows how many miles, and the chances of another car coming by anytime soon is pretty slim. With these dangers in mind, it's safe to say that the story I have for you is about an occurrence that I hope never needs to be warned of again. Now let me begin by saying that the creepiest thing about driving through these empty farmlands at night is by far the lack of light. There is no need for any streetlights in the middle of nowhere, and no towns or cities anywhere nearby. The only light besides your own headlights is that of the stars and moon above. It's a surreal experience looking out your window and seeing only the darkness beyond the railing on the side of the road. Mostly because you have no idea what could be out there. And that's why you should be scared of driving on country roads at night. One night, my boyfriend and I were driving home from my cabin in eastern Washington when I noticed a car pulled over on the side of the road. When we passed the car, I noticed that it was completely empty and wondered where the people inside could have gone, considering there was nothing even remotely in walking distance from where we were. I figured that they had run out of gas and had to hitch a ride to the nearest town. My theory of where they had gone prompted my boyfriend to tell me a story that I will never forget. In the late 90s and early 2000s, Washington State had a bit of a cult problem. This wasn't the first time I was hearing of this, considering the fact that one of the church camps I went to when I was younger was oddly enough built on the grounds of a disbanded satanic cult. Who made that decision? Anyways, most of these cults resided over in the east side because of how far it was away from everything and everybody, and they wanted to isolate themselves. These cults could basically do whatever they wanted and fly completely under the radar due to the fact that there was nobody around to stop them, because a lot of the time nobody even knew they were out there. And that's why they were able to get away with what they did. My boyfriend told me that one summer morning, a police station in one of the very few tiny towns amongst the farmlands received a call reporting a missing person. The caller claimed that her husband had not returned from his shift at the paper mill the night before, and she was worried that he had gotten into an accident because he hadn't answered any of her calls. Many of the residents in these small towns commuted to jobs way out in the country lands, because many of them were either farmers or workers at the local paper mill, so accidents at night were not uncommon. The station agreed to send out a patrol car to look for him. At one point along the road, the officer noticed that one of the speed limit signs had disappeared, and noted that it may have been the cause of the missing person's presumed accident. Local kids must have been bored, but what else did they have to do out there? The man's car was found pulled off to the side of the road, about halfway through his commute, without a single scratch on it. The man was nowhere to be found, but his car was unlocked, and his wallet and cell phone lie in plain view on the passenger seat. Something definitely did not seem right. After weeks of investigation, the man was still missing, and nobody had any idea where he had gone. For several days, the police station anxiously waited for any news that could solve the mystery behind the disappearance. But because of the usually uneventful nature of the area, the only report called in was that of another missing speed limit sign. A few days later, another call came in. There was another missing person report, almost identical to the one before. Somebody hadn't returned home from their shift the night before. The police sent out a patrol car once again, and sure enough, there it was. An untouched abandoned car on the side of the road, with the missing person's belongings clearly left behind. But there was something different this time. Faint scratch marks could be seen on the driver's seat that trailed onto the floor and out the door. It appeared that somebody had been dragged from their car. This realization of a possible assault or abduction raised great alarm, and an announcement was made to all local residents to lock their doors on their drives back home at night and be extremely cautious of anybody who may try and approach their car. One night around 2 a.m., the station received a call that would answer their disturbing question of where these people had disappeared to. A couple had been traveling on the road where the people had gone missing and had just narrowly escaped the fate of those before them. They had fortunately heard the announcement a week before and made sure their doors were locked and kept an eye out for anything out of the ordinary. Apparently, a few minutes after they had entered an area void of any cell service, they noticed a single ray of light that appeared to be floating directly in the middle of the road, just a ways down the route. Confused as to what it might be, the couple slowed down cautiously. As they neared the source of light, they saw something that gives them nightmares to this day. Standing in the middle of the road was a chain of people linked together arm in arm, creating a barrier on the street. There was a man in the middle that held a flashlight in his teeth. The car came to a complete stop. There was no way to go forward. Then, what seemed to be a split second after they had stopped their car, out of the complete and utter darkness on each side of the road, two people leapt over the railing and ran towards the car and tried to rip the doors open. The human chain had only been a distraction. Thankfully, their doors were locked, and the husband frantically switched their car into reverse and slammed the gas pedal. They had gotten away and immediately called the station once they regained service. When the police asked if they had seen where they had gone as they drove away, they simply answered with, "Back into the darkness, beyond the road." An investigation occurred, but the people in the road were never found. To this day, nobody knows who those people were or where they came from. They eventually did find the bodies of the missing people. Both victims were found bound to what appeared to be a stolen speed limit sign. Their bodies were severely burned. What could be the reasoning behind ripping people from their cars at odd hours of the night and burning them alive out in the middle of nowhere? Without any explanation, the police chalked it up to cult activity. But how could it be possible that there was no trace of these people anywhere? It was almost as if they had vanished into thin air. What's more disturbing is the fact that they could still be out there. All I can tell you is to think twice next time you're driving down a dark country road at night and mindlessly staring into that deep darkness just beyond the railing. You never know who could be staring back.
If you really like my content and want to support me, please like this video and click the subscribe button. It helps me to grow my channel and is essential in reaching a wider audience. Most of you watching my videos aren't subscribed to my channel, and that's why my animations can't reach their full potential. They aren't recommended to more people who would surely love my content as much as you do. You can always unsubscribe at any moment. Thank you in advance, and enjoy the rest of the video.
It was Halloween. My mom and dad had gone to an adult Halloween party at their friend's house and left me, a 14-year-old male, and my sister home alone to hand out candy to the neighborhood kids. We lived on a small farm surrounded by other small farms, and Halloweens were pretty mellow. My sister was 12 and had finally gotten to the age where she thought trick-or-treating and dressing up was embarrassing, and I just liked staying home and playing video games with my friends, so I didn't usually go out on Halloween. The only issue that night was my parents had forgotten to get candy, so they told us to hand out whatever fruit or pretzels we had in the kitchen. And that was so embarrassing for me, having to give kids something they didn't want on the one night of the year that they were supposed to be getting candy. I wasn't too worried about it, given that not many kids lived in our area, so we figured that we wouldn't have to answer the door much at all. We handed out the first batch of apples to disappointed kids, and by 11 p.m., we assumed that we were done for the night. Then came a knock at the door. It was late, and I didn't really want to answer the door again, but I figured it was just little kids, and I didn't want to be rude and ignore them when they could see that the lights were on inside. I got to the door and pulled it open, and was shocked to see 4 very tall guys standing there, all en masse, holding their pillowcases open, seemingly expecting candy. "Sorry guys, we don't have any candy. We've been handing out apples to the kids all night. Might have some pretzels if you want some." The tallest one in front just tilted his head at me almost like he was confused by what I was saying, but none of them actually spoke. I didn't really know what else to do, so I started to close the door. When I went to shut it all the way, one of the guys put his shoe between the door and the door frame to prevent me from closing it. I opened the door again to ask him what his problem was, but instead, he and his friends just pushed their way inside. I yelled for my sister to run and hide before being shoved to the ground. One of the intruders pulled out a bat out from under his robe and in a low, deep voice said, "We didn't come for any candy." I managed to get onto my hands and knees before being kicked in the stomach, knocking me to the ground once again. I tried screaming, but the thing about living on a farm with more land between you and your neighbors than the average neighborhood is no one is going to hear you scream when you need help, but I kept screaming anyways. "It's Halloween. You really think anyone's going to think twice about a kid screaming?" And this made the rest of them laugh behind their masks. "Look, I don't know what you want, but I can give you money if you just leave. Please, you don't need to hurt anyone." I expected a response, but he just laughed at my shaky voice. In a baby talk voice, one of the guys said, "Aw, look, the little baby's scared. Where's Daddy to save you when you need him?" I felt a stinging at my side as the guy with the bat swung it directly into my ribs. I was trying to listen to the voices to figure out how old they were, and from what I could tell, they seemed young enough to be teenagers. There was a lot of thoughts going through my mind in that moment. I mean, they definitely weren't mature at all, and I crawled to the corner of the room in pain as they spoke to each other about what rooms they would go in and what they were going to take. One of the guys took me outside while the others looked around the house for whatever it was they wanted. I saw my sister on the roof, hiding outside her window from the man that I could see had just entered her room. The guy that took me outside had me by the collar of my shirt and was leading me toward the barn. He opened the door to the pig pen and pushed me inside. Threatening me with the bat, he made me roll around in the mud and film me as he forced me to oink. I was terrified, exhausted, confused, embarrassed, and felt completely humiliated at what I was being forced to do. The guy was laughing the whole time, too. He told me to get up and let me out of the barn and back inside the house to show the rest of his friends what he'd done to me. And they only just joined in the torment. They made me drink the toilet water, eat trash from the trash can, and other things I can't even speak of as they pulled me around. The whole time I was just hoping they wouldn't find my sister. The strange thing is, they hadn't even mentioned her once. They took me to my room and began taking turns throwing punches. I had no idea what I had done to deserve this horrible beating and torture that I was being put through. I was just going through torture in my mind, and I had no idea. I almost blacked out many times. 10 minutes into the beating, I heard one of them ask me where my sister was. They told me that they wanted to have some fun with her and that they'd stop hurting me if I told them. And this was the moment I decided to stop talking completely. They could hurt me all they wanted. I was not letting them near my sister. They asked me again, spitting in my face each time I refused to talk. But there was nothing they could do to me that would get me to give her up. Eventually, they tied me to a chair in the kitchen and just exited the house after thoroughly trashing the place. And I must have blacked out at some point because when I woke up, I was in the hospital attached to just a bunch of machines. My mom was crying when she noticed me awake and took her time to tell me exactly what happened. It turns out the girl I had just broken up with the week before asked her brother to scare me as revenge for hurting her. I guess he and his friends were just insane for taking it to the extent that they did. I guess they just got caught up in it, as disgusting as that sounds. Thankfully, they were all arrested, but only the brother was actually sentenced to some jail time. He received 5 years for aggravated assault and home invasion charges. The other guys got probation as a plea deal for ratting him out. I'm still in a lot of pain since this happened less than a year ago, but I guess there's one thing I'd tell kids answering the door for Halloween when their parents aren't home. Always check your peephole first. I'm a cow farmer in the Midwest. It's not the best work, but it is work, and with how hard it is to find a job with decent pay these days, I've learned to appreciate it. The job entails cleaning up after the cows, checking their hooves, milking, and helping them give birth when necessary. It's a pretty messy job when you look at it from the outside, but I've gotten pretty used to it. I don't even smell the stink anymore like I did when I first started. It used to be almost unbearable, but now, really nothing. The farm was my father's before me and his father's before him. And the story I'm about to tell you is my dad's. He told it to me back when I first started the job as almost what not to do when tending to the animals and working on the farm. He's long passed now, God rest his soul, but this story has haunted me for years, so I figured I'd let other people hear it and judge it for themselves. This is back in the 60s when Dad was in his early 20s. He worked on the farm with his father, Bill, at the time. He hated it. He hated the stench that would only get worse when the heat came in the summer, and picking up after the cows was the worst. See, the cows stayed in this huge barn. It was actually more like a big warehouse where they're fed and kept throughout the night. They got to graze during the day, and throughout the night the cows would defecate and their feces drop to the concrete floor beneath them. Then in the morning, when the cows would go out to graze, my dad would take a really long hose and spray the droppings to the end of the building down a shaft that leads to a big tank below the barn. The tank would fill with the droppings, and once a week we had a guy that would come by and empty the tank and dispose of the waste. It was really nasty work, but my dad did it nonetheless. Well, my grandfather decided that it was just too much work to do on the farm with just himself and my dad, so they decided to hire another farmhand. They didn't get anyone interested in the job for the first few weeks until they met a man at a local feed store named Fred. He was in his late 20s and eager to work. He hadn't had a job in years and was desperate for pay since his wife was pregnant with their first child. My grandfather hired him right there in that feed store, and by the next day, Fred was on the farm working harder than anyone my dad had ever seen work. He was determined and super ambitious. He was constantly running around the farm fixing stuff that needed fixing and trying to learn absolutely everything it was that they did. He loved the job and told everyone how he just wanted to be good at what he was being paid to do. He believed in good, honest work and that people should earn the money they're working for. My dad admitted he loved having Fred around, not just because he worked hard, but also because he was gullible and pretty easily manipulated, I guess. My dad had certain tasks given to him by my grandpa throughout the day, and each time he was told to do something, he just passed that task along to Fred. He didn't mind because he didn't know, and my dad didn't care because it meant less of the work that he hated. About 4 months went by with Fred doing most of the work around the farm, and my dad even started to find it a little funny that he really would do whatever he was told. Without question, he was happy to do it. One hot summer morning, the cows had just gone out to graze, and my grandpa told my dad to spray the droppings down the shaft at the end of the barn like he usually did. My dad then passed the job along to Fred as he sat along the side of the barn to have a smoke. When Fred was done, he came outside to tell my dad that he had an idea that he thought would highly benefit the farm. He told my dad that if he emptied the tank below the barn themselves, they would be able to use the cow feces as manure in the fields. It would fertilize the plants and make them grow bigger and faster. My dad told me that at first he thought the idea was stupid, but then he figured it would be funny to see if Fred actually tried and emptied that feces tank, so he agreed. He didn't tell my grandpa because he knew he never would have approved, and he just wanted to see how this would play out. He showed Fred where to go to the release valve and empty the tank into the big barrels. He told him to be very careful and to not turn the valve too fast, otherwise the line would get clogged and they'd have to call someone to fix it. My dad then left Fred alone to do what he had planned and decided to take a walk around the barn to check the gates and make sure everything was in order. What my dad didn't know at the time was that Fred would end up turning the valve too fast and the line would end up getting clogged. Fred would then open the tank from above and reach a pole into the sludge to try and dislodge whatever was blocking the line. My dad heard screaming coming from inside the barn and he rushed over to see what was wrong. He made his way down into the tank and was horrified by what he found. Fred had fallen into the huge 5,000-gallon tank that hadn't been emptied for a week and was now drowning in the thick feces, desperately reaching out for help. By the time my dad got to the top of the ladder and looked into the tank, all he could see was Fred's hand poking out of the brown goo. He grabbed onto it and tried pulling him out, but he had no leverage at all on the top of that tank. He managed to pull Fred up long enough for him to tell my dad that he was just trying to fix it himself since he knew that they'd have to pay someone for his mistake. He felt bad, and my dad reassured him everything would be okay and to just hold on. And that's when his grip failed and Fred plunged back under the thick excrement once again. This time, no part of Fred's body was able to be grabbed onto to possibly rescue him. My dad had no idea what to do, so he ran across the farm as fast as he could to get my grandpa, who immediately called the police. And by the time they made it back to the tank, Fred's hand had disappeared under the sludge, and there was nothing my dad and grandpa could do but wait. The police showed up with firemen, and they didn't know much of what to do either. They ended up reaching a metal pole down into the tank with a sort of loop on the end, and when they pulled Fred out, it was very clear that he had passed. My dad was horrified and felt like it was his fault. He knew it was a bad idea, but thought it would be funny. He could have stopped Fred, but his own arrogance let him do it. Fred's wife became a widow and she never remarried. She named their son after him and eventually moved out of town. My dad made a point to work as hard as Fred did every day for the rest of his life in honor of the man whose death he felt he was responsible for. My dad passed away in 2018, and the last thing he said to me was to never take advantage of someone's hard work.
I want to start out by saying that I'm a 25-year-old male, average but broad build, and I'm somewhat taller at 6'1", so not what you'd usually consider an easy target or victim. I'm an avid outdoorsman. I love being in the middle of the woods, either with friends or alone. There's a certain peace I find when I'm sitting alone by a stream with nothing but nature all around me. I specifically love hiking, and I usually start hiking in the spring. My favorite spot to hike locally is in a small town in southwest Ohio. This is normally a very peaceful, quiet, and relaxing place. Usually you'll run into a couple of other hikers or families swimming in the creek nearby, or just a few animals along your trail. This day, however, well, it turned out to be entirely different. It started off like every other hiking trip. I grabbed my pocket knife and water bottle and headed toward my spot. Once I arrived, I picked my favorite trail and started down the loop. It was a windy day in mid-spring, and I had been hiking for about half an hour when I then heard what sounded like a woman screaming for help in the distance. I paused momentarily at the bottom of a small incline. Listening closely, when I heard the scream yet again. At this time, I ran up the incline to see if there was someone injured nearby who maybe needed help. But when I reached the top of the small hill, my stomach wrenched, and I got the feeling that I should just go on about my business. So following my instincts, I did just that. After that, I stopped a ways up ahead and listened again. I hadn't heard the noise in a while, but I wanted to make sure that I didn't hear it again. The wind blew once more, and the noise came back as the trees swayed back and forth. I decided that the noise was from the trees and just kept on my trail. As I tried to shake the eerie sick feeling in my stomach, I rounded a bend in the trail, and as I got to the clearing around the brush, I saw a man on his hands and knees on the ground with his face in the dirt. The man had a dog with him, and he was wearing a backpack. I figured that he had dropped something and was looking for it, so I just kept heading his way down the trail. As I drew closer, the man looked up at me and stood up from the ground. He was a larger guy, probably about 6'4" if I had to guess. Pretty stocky build. His face looked like that of a drug user. He blocked my path. I stopped about 10 feet from him, standing facing him, maintaining eye contact and distance. He had asked me if I ever smelled these flowers, as he pointed to them on the ground. I then said, "No, I haven't," as friendly as I could at the time. He then looked at me and said,
"Every spring, I have to get down on my hands and knees and smell these flowers. They're just nothing like you'll ever smell."
I kinda just gave a, that's cool. He paused for a few seconds, and I could tell he was sizing me up. After his pause, he said,
"Yeah, you should smell them sometime."
And he paused again, halfway motioning for me to get down and smell these flowers. I said, "Yeah, maybe I will some other time," and he then gave me a look of subtle frustration, giving another long pause. I broke the silence by telling him that he has a really pretty dog.
"Yeah, she's a really good girl,"
he said, at which point then I decided I had enough of this interaction, and I said, "Alright, well, I'm gonna keep on my way then." The man paused again, and he just told me to take care, and then turned to keep going down the opposite direction of me. I started walking again, and after about 5 seconds, I peered over my shoulder just to make sure that he wasn't following me. But he was gone. He had completely vanished from the trail in just a couple of seconds. You'd think I would be kind of relieved to be away from him, but not knowing where he was really put me on high alert. I decided to try and enjoy the rest of my hike and went down this trail that I had always seen but never explored. The trail then went about a quarter mile through a field with trees on each side of the trail. Then at a sign with a map, split off into 3 mini trails that all led to backpacker campsites. As I went down the trail, I stopped for a second to use the bathroom and then check over my shoulder again. Nothing. I made it to the sign at the split, and my stomach wrenched again, telling me not to go down that trail anymore, to turn back. So I did. I turned back, and I started back down the trail to the main loop. I pulled my knife from my pocket and had it ready in my hand. I was about halfway back to the main loop when I then saw the man yet again in the distance. He had doubled back and was now walking straight towards me again. I've went over this in my head 100 times, and it just didn't logically make sense for him to turn around because it was only about a quarter of the way through his end of the loop. I was about 3/4 of my way through the loop since we were heading opposite directions. He walked toward me, a lump forming in my throat and my stomach still turning. As he passed me, he had a look of annoyance on his face. He then saw my hand with my knife in it and just said once more,
"Take care,"
and just kept walking past me with his dog. Luckily, that was my last encounter with him and the noises I heard. I'm pretty positive there was no woman at all. I don't really know if he was truly a person or some kind of creature imitating a person, but I don't really care. I think those screams were actually a lure that luckily I didn't fall for. As for the rest of my trip, I hurried quickly out of those woods that day. I do still hike there, and I do still go on that trail, but I now won't do it without my pistol on my hip. I think he planned to trick me into smelling the flowers so he could avoid a fight and then hit me while I was down. God only knows what he would have done. I think because I was armed and I followed my instincts is why I came out of those woods that day. Maybe it doesn't sound so bad in this retelling of my story, but I know what I felt that day. No matter what your gender or size is, you can be a victim if you let yourself be. Always follow your instincts, always be aware of your surroundings, and always be prepared to protect yourself, especially if you're alone in the woods.